I remember the smell. Vanilla cake. Sweet, warm, oddly comforting. It filled the entire kitchen like a memory that didn't belong. My mom never baked. Not on holidays. Not even when I graduated high school. But that morning, on my 18th birthday, she did. That should have been my first clue. The cake sat untouched on the counter by noon. I was still in my pajamas when my dad called me into the living room. I padded in barefoot, blinking against the sunlight bleeding through the blinds. Something felt off. Mom wasn't looking at me. Dad didn't even pretend to smile. "Sit down," he said. His tone was cold. The kind of cold that used to freeze me when I knocked over a glass of milk as a kid. I sat heart low in my chest, every part of me on edge. Then Mom dropped it, no sugarcoating, no warning. "You're adopted." Just like that. No hugs, no tears, not even an awkward pause to let it settle. "We took you in when you were 2, Dad added like he was reciting a weather report. "Your birth mother couldn't care for you. We did what we could." I didn't move. My breath stopped somewhere between inhale and panic. Then Mom again, "We think it's time you find your own way now. You're old enough." My ears rang. I wasn't sure I heard her right. But then Dad reached under the couch and slid a small duffel bag across the carpet like he'd been waiting for this moment. "There's some money in there. A few clothes. We've arranged a hostel for a few nights until you get settled." They were kicking me out. On my birthday, I didn't cry, didn't scream. I stood up slowly, pulled the bag strap over my shoulder, and said the only thing that wouldn't make me crumble: "Thanks." They didn't notice how tightly I gripped the strap, or the flicker in my eyes that wasn't shock. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that 3 weeks earlier, I found something. A letter, buried under tax returns and old photo albums in the hallway cabinet. The envelope was faded, addressed to a woman named Alina Voska. Inside was a birth certificate, my name on it. Hers listed as the mother, no father. That's when everything cracked. I searched her name online, then at the library, then through microfilm and yellowed newspaper clips that smelled like dust and truth. I pieced it all together. Alina Voska wasn't unfit. She wasn't some teenage mistake. She was a licensed psychiatrist who tried to blow the whistle on a powerful man, Dr. Richard Halden, director of a private women's wellness center that went dark in the early 2000s. She accused him of unethical experimentation, psychological abuse, mind-altering drug trials. She was arrested, institutionalized. No charges were filed against Halden. He later became the public face of the Halden Wellness Foundation, a name I had seen over and over in my house growing up. My adoptive father, Graham, had donated to that foundation for years. I used to think it was just philanthropy. Now, I knew better. They weren't helping women. They were erasing them. That envelope in my duffel bag? It wasn't just paper. It was a fuse. The hostel smelled like bleach and loneliness. The mattress sagged. The pillow felt like packing foam. I kept the duffel close, one hand always touching the zipper. That night, I barely slept. I wasn't scared. I was focused. The next morning, I left before sunrise. Walked an hour through brittle air to the only place that felt like shelter, the public library. I went straight to the microfilm machine, loaded the reel I'd stashed last week, and stared at the same headline until it stopped hurting: "Whistleblower psychiatrist Alina Voska, institutionalized after failed accusations." The photo showed a woman being led away in cuffs. Dark eyes, cheekbones sharp from stress. She didn't look broken. She looked defiant. The article made her sound unstable, delusional. It quoted Halden, calling her disturbed and obsessed with conspiracy. A month later, she was sent to a facility called Stonemount Psychiatric. No follow-up. No justice, just silence. But I had one clue, a whisper in the archives, a small note at the end of a different article that mentioned some Stonemount patients being transferred to another place after it shut down Larkridge Behavioral Center. I needed to find it, but I had no money, no phone, no car. Only that envelope, and hunger. Not just the physical kind, the kind that grows in your chest when your entire life is a lie, and you want nothing more than to claw it all down and rebuild from the ashes. I stared at a help wanted sign across the street. A diner, greasy window, flickering neon sign. I walked in, told the manager I'd scrub floors, wash dishes, whatever he needed. He looked at me like I'd already lost. "You start tomorrow, 6 a.m. 5 days later, I had $122 in cash and blisters on both hands. It was enough. The bus to Larkridge left at 10:40 a.m. I didn't say goodbye. I just walked out with the envelope tucked into my jacket. The bus ride took 3 hours. The center was at the edge of a forgotten town, behind dead trees and a cracked iron gate. The sign read, Larkridge Center for Long-Term Psychiatric Care. It looked more like a mausoleum than a hospital. Inside, the woman at the desk barely glanced up when I said, "I'm here to visit Alina Voska." She asked, "Relation?" The first said, "I'm her daughter." She hesitated, then dialed a number, spoke softly, and nodded toward a hallway. Second door on the left. Keep it short. I stood in that doorway for a full breath, then another, and then I saw her. Thin, pale, hair streaked with silver, sitting by the window like time had given up on her. She didn't look at me, not at first. Then she turned, and everything shifted. Her eyes met mine. I can't explain it, but something in her stilled like the air had stopped moving around her. "My name is Kala," I said. I think I'm your daughter." She didn't flinch, just stared. Then something deep in her face cracked. Not emotion, not fear, recognition. "You look like your grandmother," she whispered. I froze. "You remember? They want me to forget. They keep trying, but I know who I am. I know what they did." I stepped closer. My voice trembled. "Why did they take me?" Her gaze darted to the ceiling, the walls. "They're always watching. Not all the cameras are real, but some are. What did they do to you? Experiments. On memory. On behavior. On truth." I tried to stop it. "They made me a warning." She looked at me again. "They let you go because they thought I was gone." "I'm not," I said, "and neither are you." She didn't blink much. That was the first thing I noticed. Alina, my mother, kept her eyes steady like she'd trained herself not to flinch, not to show anything someone could use against her. She looked past me and into corners, like there were ghosts still hanging around, watching. And maybe there were. I stayed as long as I could that first day, but when the nurse came by and tapped the watch on her wrist, Alina went quiet like a switch had been flipped. I wanted to scream. Not at her, not at anyone in particular, just at the air for swallowing a woman like her whole. But I nodded instead, kissed her cheek, and left. My steps were heavy walking out, but my mind was already sprinting ahead. Because now it was real. She was real. And if they thought burying her in a forgotten building on the edge of nowhere would be the end of the story, they had no idea what they'd just started. Back at the motel, I wrote everything down. Every detail. Her posture, her words. The way she hesitated before mentioning the name Halden, but never said it fully. The tremble in her hands when she talked about the therapy sessions being recorded. I pulled out the envelope again and looked through the documents one more time. Her birth certificate. My adoption paperwork, forged and filed under some obscure state ordinance that no one could trace easily. The article I printed with her photo. I laid it all out on the motel bed, like a puzzle, with half the pieces flipped upside down. Then I grabbed the notebook and started organizing what I knew. Alina Voska, institutionalized under suspicious circumstances. Dr. Richard Halden, powerful figure, now leading a foundation supposedly dedicated to women's health. Graham Bishop, my adoptive father, not just a donor but a named board member in the Halden Foundation's filings from 2007. There it was. A chain, clear as day. But I needed more. I needed evidence that wasn't just personal, but prosecutable. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I searched forums, old medical board records, archived meeting minutes, anything that smelled even slightly like a thread worth pulling. Around 3 a.m., I hit on something. A decommissioned state-run clinic report from 1999 had Alina's name listed in the investigation notes. It was a footnote, barely legible, but next to it was something else. A code. EV91 LTC under a section labeled Non-Compliant Behavioral Subjects. I stared at it for minutes before realizing that wasn't just her initials. That was her case ID. They reduced her to a label, a number. I copied everything and bookmarked the file, even though I knew if they had any control left, it might disappear tomorrow. I needed to move fast. I returned to the library the next morning and took a seat in the farthest corner I could find. I connected to public Wi-Fi, used a burner email I created months ago for things just like this, and started reaching out. I emailed 3 journalists, 2 nonprofit investigative networks, and a blog run by ex-hospital employees that specialized in abuse reports buried by bureaucracy. My message was short but direct. I have documents, patient records, and a living victim of long-term institutional abuse under a fraudulent psychiatric order. Her name is Alina Voska. The foundation behind it is still active. I need someone who's not afraid to make this public. Then I waited. An hour passed. 2. And just when I thought maybe no one cared, I got a response. Meet me. Midnight. South exit of the library. Ask for Lena. I didn't know if it was a setup. It could have been a trap. But when you've already been abandoned, lied to, and rewritten out of your own life, what's one more risk? I stayed at the library all day, reading, printing, eating nothing but vending machine crackers and bad coffee. At 11:53 p.m., I walked outside. The air was cold again. Always was in that town, like it never really left winter behind. At 12:04, a woman in a dark hoodie stepped out from the shadows. She looked mid-30s, tired but alert. "You Kala?" she asked. I nodded. "You're not the first to come looking," she said, "but you might be the one who finishes it." We walked without speaking for 10 minutes until we reached a parked car with no plates. She got in the driver's seat and motioned for me to join. Her name was Lena Rollins, a former medical rights activist turned whistleblower tracker. Her sister had been committed at 16 for delusional depression and never made it out. She'd spent the last decade uncovering where girls like her sister were sent and why they never came back. When I showed her Alina's documents, her hands actually shook. "Do you know how many times I've looked for this name?" she whispered. "They told me she was just noise." A footnote. I said nothing, just handed her the flash drive I'd been building since that first night in the hostel. Everything was on it: documents, transcripts, screenshots, even a few redacted intake reports I'd managed to copy from an old database leak tied to the Halden Foundation. Lena took it and promised she'd get it to someone who could help. "But you can't stay here," she said. "Not after this. If they're watching, and they probably are, you need to disappear." I didn't argue. I just asked where. She gave me a name and a town 2 states over. Said it was a safe house. Nothing fancy, but quiet. I thanked her, and before I left, she handed me something I hadn't expected. A small photo of her sister. "So you remember who we're doing this for," she said. The next morning, I caught a rideshare out of town and didn't look back. The place Lena sent me to wasn't a house so much as a basement room under a bakery. It smelled like yeast and cinnamon, and I cried for 10 straight minutes the first night because it was the first time in weeks I felt safe. The next few days blurred together. I checked email under new aliases, used only cash, burned every receipt. The only person I kept in contact with was Lena, and even that was through encrypted channels. Then, on the 4th night, something changed. An email came through at 2:17 a.m. The subject line read, "Rothman." The name made my stomach twist. Claire Rothman. The journalism student who had vanished after digging into the same story. The one Alina mentioned in passing with a tremble in her voice. The one the nurse had warned me about. I opened the email expecting more horror. Instead, it had a phone number and a single sentence. "She's alive." I didn't know what that meant, not fully, but I knew it changed everything. I stared at the screen for a full minute before realizing I was holding my breath. Alive. That word felt too big for the tiny basement I was sitting in, like it didn't belong in the same air as a cracked ceiling and cinnamon-drenched walls. Claire Rothman, the girl who vanished, the one who asked questions no one wanted answered. Alina mentioned her in whispers. The nurse at Larkridge said she never came back. But here she was, not a ghost, not a cautionary tale, alive. I picked up my phone and dialed the number in the email, not even stopping to question if it was a good idea. It rang twice. Then a voice answered, low, guarded, but steady. "Who gave you this number?" she asked. I didn't hesitate. "Lena Rollins. My name's Kala. I found Alina Voska. She's still alive. And I think we're both after the same thing." The silence that followed felt like the kind of silence that had weight, not absence. Like she was deciding whether or not I was worth trusting. Then she said, "Meet me tomorrow night. The train station in Carlisle. I'll find you." I didn't sleep that night. Again, the excitement, the dread, the what-ifs, they collided so loud in my brain that even closing my eyes didn't give me peace. But the next morning, I packed the flash drive, the envelope, and every printed copy of Alina's files I'd stashed over the past few weeks. The train to Carlisle was only 2 hours, but it felt like crossing into another lifetime. I spent the whole ride watching the reflection of my face in the window, wondering if I looked any different from the girl who got kicked out of her childhood home with a duffel bag and a polite smile. At the station, I waited near the vending machines, pretending to scroll through my phone. I spotted her before she saw me. Claire Rothman didn't look like someone who had been erased. She looked like someone who had crawled her way back, with nails still dirty from the climb. Her hair was shorter now, dyed a soft rust color, and her eyes scanned the crowd like she was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. When our eyes met, something unspoken passed between us, not recognition, but understanding. She walked up and said, "Let's take a walk." We didn't talk for the first few minutes. The streets were damp from an earlier rain, and the sky was that bruised shade of gray that makes everything feel like it's holding its breath. Finally, she asked, "How long have you known?" I told her everything. The cake, the adoption, the envelope. Alina's voice in that cold room. She listened without interrupting, just nodded now and then like she'd already heard every beat of my story echoed somewhere in her own. When I mentioned my adoptive father's name, Graham Bishop, she stopped walking. "Bishop?" she said slowly. "He's on the internal memos I found, not just a donor. He signed off on funding experimental therapy protocols. He wasn't a bystander, Kala. He was a gatekeeper." My stomach turned. I knew he wasn't innocent, but hearing it from someone else, someone who'd risked everything to find the truth, it made the guilt I'd been carrying twist into something else, something sharper. Claire pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket and handed it to me. It was a photocopy of an old personnel document with 3 names circled: Richard Halden, Graham Bishop, and someone I hadn't seen before, Dr. Evelyn Maris. Claire tapped the 3rd name. She was the clinical overseer, the one who authorized the behavioral studies. Halden was the face. Bishop handled the money. But Maris? She wrote the playbook. We sat down at a cafe with fogged windows and a waitress who didn't care that we ordered nothing but coffee. Claire laid out her files while I spread mine beside them. Dates, signatures, case numbers, patient logs stamped with red ink, and terms like non-compliant risk of contagion, emotional escalation. Alina's name appeared over and over, always tied to warnings, security flags, attempted disclosures, and near the bottom of one report, scrawled in handwriting so tight it was nearly unreadable, "Subject EV remains vocal despite sedation. Recommend isolation." Claire tapped it with the end of her pen. This is the point where they stopped treating her like a person. We spent hours comparing notes, timelines, names. Claire had tracked nearly a dozen other women whose records ended abruptly in the mid-2000s. Some were listed as transferred, others as discharged. A few had death certificates, but the causes were always vague. Pulmonary failure, seizure, unexplained trauma. They were lab rats, Claire said quietly. And no one ever asked what happened to them after the trials ended. Because it was easier not to, by the time the cafe closed, we had a plan. Claire had been building a digital repository for years. Names, files, memos, video clips. She never released it because she didn't have confirmation that Alina was still alive. But now we did. "We make this public," she said. "Not just a story, a case. With proof, witnesses, timelines. We leak it all at once to journalists, investigators, advocacy groups. If we're loud enough, they can't bury it this time." I nodded, feeling something inside me settle. Not peace, not yet, but purpose. We left the cafe with matching folders under our arms, and a shared knowledge that from this point forward, we weren't just collecting evidence. We were building an indictment. The next day, Claire introduced me to her contact, a cybersecurity specialist named Drew, who looked like he lived off coffee and conspiracy theories. He helped us encrypt everything, scatter backups across cloud servers, and prep a launch sequence that would send the files to dozens of outlets simultaneously. But he also had a warning. The Halden Foundation is still active, still connected. If they catch wind of this before the release, they won't just send lawyers, they'll send erasers. People whose job is to make loose ends disappear. I asked him if he meant that literally. He didn't answer, just handed me a burner phone and said, "Don't trust calls from familiar numbers." Back at the safe house, I checked in with Lena. She told me the fallout was already starting. One of the nurses at Larkridge had gone missing. Janet, the one who let me into Alina's room that first day. Her apartment had been cleared out overnight. No forwarding address, no trace, just silence. I felt like I'd swallowed a shard of glass. I kept thinking about how she warned me, about how Claire had vanished once, about how I might be next. But I wasn't backing down, not now. The truth wasn't just about justice. It was about every woman they tried to erase, about every family they broke, and about making sure Alina never had to sit in a room full of ghosts again. The day before the scheduled leak, I visited her one last time. Larkridge felt heavier than before, more watched, like the walls themselves knew the clock was ticking. Alina was seated in her usual spot, but this time she was humming, quiet, almost tuneless, but steady. I sat down and took her hand. She looked at me, and her eyes, though still dulled by medication, had something behind them I hadn't seen before. Hope. I told her we were close, that soon the world would know what they did. She didn't smile, but she squeezed my hand and whispered something so soft I almost missed it. Burn it all. That night, I watched Claire hit send. Dozens of emails, files, video links. A compressed folder labeled Even 91, the forgotten. And just like that, the countdown began. The leak went live at 9 o.m. By 9:07, the podcast episode dropped. Claire had narrated it herself, calm but cutting, starting with a question no one could ignore. What happens to women who become inconvenient? She told Alina's story from the beginning, backed by audio files, redacted memos, and one short video clip that stopped people cold. It was black and white security footage from Larkridge, dated 2006. A woman, Alina, sitting silently in a chair, eyes blank, while a man's voice off-screen asked over and over, "Do you remember who you were before?" And her reply, slow, heavy, like pushing words through a wall, "They took her." That clip alone went viral in under an hour. Reddit threads exploded. Independent journalists ran with it. Advocacy groups reposted the files and tagged every relevant public health account. By noon, hashtags started trending, hashtag Eve91, Forgotten Women, hashtag Halden Files. It spread faster than any of us expected. We watched it unfold in real time from Claire's apartment, which doubled as ground zero for everything now. Drew had locked down our IPs, routed traffic through a half-dozen layers of encryption, but he still kept muttering to himself like he knew the blowback was coming, and he was right. By 3 p.m., the Halden Foundation's website had been scrubbed. Their press page went down first, then their leadership bios. Someone tried to bury it fast, but it was too late. Every journalist that had ever gotten a denial from them suddenly remembered unanswered emails. The Foundation issued a statement that evening calling the leak deeply irresponsible, claiming the files were selectively edited and illegally obtained. But they didn't deny the names, didn't deny the dates, and they didn't deny that Alina Voska existed. They couldn't anymore. The next morning, the State Attorney General's office announced they were reviewing the documents. That word reviewing felt small, but it meant a door had cracked open. And if there's one thing about doors, once they crack, you can kick them down. Still, we knew better than to celebrate. Claire kept checking her rearview mirror. Drew installed a second lock on the door. I turned off my burner phone and stashed it in a bus station locker 3 towns away. That's when the threats started. The first one came as a voicemail. No number, no voice, just the sound of a clock ticking. I played it twice before deleting it. The second was a handwritten note left in Claire's mailbox. No return address, no signature. It said, "Some memories are best left buried." She read it aloud once, then burned it in her kitchen sink. Drew installed cameras that night and set up motion alerts. The third warning came for me. I had gone to the corner store 10 minutes, tops, and when I came back, there was a photo tucked into the safe house's front gate. It was a picture of Alina from decades ago, smiling, holding a newborn. On the back, in red ink, someone had written, "That was the last time she smiled for real. Let it go." I didn't cry. I just walked inside, shut the door, and made a list of everything we still had left to publish. Because if they wanted us scared, they'd picked the wrong girl. I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt fire. The media pressure kept building. Bigger outlets started running with the story, slowly at first, like they didn't want to be first in line if it turned out to be another internet hoax. But then the second wave of files hit. Drew had built in a time release every 48 hours. A new folder dropped automatically to pre-selected contacts. The second drop included more memos, intake logs, internal emails signed by Graham Bishop authorizing what they called non-standard compliance monitoring. That phrase got dissected by every lawyer, Redditor, and former patient advocate online. The public wasn't just angry now, they were furious, especially when someone leaked a donor list showing just how many politicians, judges, and media execs had connections to the foundation. Suddenly, no one wanted to be associated with it. Lawsuits began forming like storm clouds. Whistleblowers came forward. One woman posted anonymously that her mother had been institutionalized under Dr. Evelyn Maris in 1998 and never came back. Another said she'd been admitted to Silverpine, the predecessor to Larkridge, and was told not to speak unless spoken to or risk sedation. Each post added another thread to the web, and in the middle of it all was Alina. I couldn't stop thinking about her, still locked in that place, still under their thumb. Claire and I knew we couldn't wait for courts to catch up or systems to play nice. We had to get her out, not later now. We reached out to Lena again, told her we were ready. She didn't ask questions, just said, "I'll handle the exit. You bring the proof." That night, I packed every medical document, every signed memo, every video clip that linked Alina's condition directly to the Foundation's treatments. We printed copies, watermarked them, and put them in a folder labeled Emergency Release. If anything went wrong, Drew would hit the trigger, and every copy would flood social media again, this time with photos, patient IDs, and direct legal threats. It was insurance. Not just for Alina, but for us. The plan was simple. Claire would stay back and monitor comms. Drew would watch the feeds. Lena and I would walk into Larkridge with a court order signed off by a recently sympathetic judge, whose name had quietly appeared in the leak's support threads. The paper gave us temporary emergency guardianship over Alina, based on medical neglect and sustained psychological harm. It was barely legal, but it was enough. We arrived at Larkridge just after sunset. The building looked smaller than I remembered, like it had shrunk under the weight of its own rot. Lena handled the paperwork. I waited in the car, heart pounding, fingers curled around the folder like it was a lifeline. 20 minutes passed, then 30, then the front door opened. Lena walked out. Behind her, slowly, with uncertain steps, came Alina. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes were clearer. And when she saw me, she didn't say anything at first, just reached out and touched my cheek like she was trying to prove I was real. "Kala," she said finally, not a question, a name, a memory, pulled back from wherever they tried to bury it. I helped her into the car, and we drove away. No alarms, no one followed, no one stopped us. But we all knew that didn't mean it was over. It just meant the real fight was about to begin. We kept her hidden for the first few days, monitored her meds, gave her space, let her speak only when she wanted. She remembered more than we thought. Names, faces, the way they changed her dosage every time she asked too many questions. She remembered Graham, not just his face but his role. "He used to come in wearing a tie with little blue dots," she said once, her voice flat. "Said I was too smart to be left alone. Then he made sure I was never alone again. I recorded everything. Claire transcribed it, Drew secured it." Lena found a trauma specialist, willing to work pro bono, someone who had been quietly collecting stories like Alina's for years, waiting for a moment just like this. As soon as the therapist confirmed Alina was lucid, coherent, and could testify, Claire called the press. This time, she didn't narrate the podcast. Alina did. Alina didn't speak much during the recording, but when she did, the air in the room changed. She didn't sound angry. She didn't even sound sad. Her voice was measured, like she'd been practicing the words in her head for years, each syllable sharpened by silence. She started with her name, her credentials, her title, and then like a gentle knife, she unfolded everything they tried to erase. The foundation, the fake diagnoses, the isolation rooms, the experiments dressed up as therapy. She described the first time she was strapped down, the drugs, the white noise used to break sleep cycles. She listed the names of women she remembered, most of them gone now, but not forgotten. "They told us it was for our healing," she said. But what they really meant was they were healing their image by making us quiet. Claire kept the mic steady, didn't flinch when Alina mentioned the sessions being recorded without consent. Drew was already syncing the files with footage, overlays, and official documents. I sat across from her, not asking questions, not interrupting, just listening. Because this wasn't just her story. This was a piece of every woman who'd been locked away for being inconvenient, too loud, too smart, or simply too hard to control. When the episode dropped, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Thousands of listeners commented within hours. Survivors, daughters, medical workers who'd stayed quiet and finally couldn't anymore. Alina's voice had become a beacon, and with it the tide began to shift. The Attorney General issued a formal investigation order within 3 days. Class action lawsuits were filed across multiple states. News outlets that once brushed the story aside now sent reporters to dig up every inch of the Halden Foundation's history. Halden himself went into hiding, his last statement a cold denial that fell apart under the weight of video footage and financial records. Evelyn Maris was subpoenaed within the week. Graham Bishop, my adoptive father, refused to comment, but we knew from internal chatter he'd been served too. I didn't hear from him directly until the 4th day after the broadcast. A voicemail, clipped and dry like always. "You're making a mistake. There's more at risk than you understand. Call me." I didn't call. I didn't need to, because now the story belonged to the world, and no carefully worded threat could put it back in the dark. But exposure has a cost. The next attack wasn't legal. It was digital. Drew's systems caught it early, an attempt to breach the server that held the raw evidence files. It wasn't some amateur hacker. It was a coordinated hit. Multiple IPs scattered across continents, masked behind fake user activity. Someone wanted everything we had to vanish without a trace. Drew fought it off, barely. And by the time the threat was contained, half our backups had been erased. We moved everything onto hard drives, then mailed duplicates across the country to our trusted contacts. No more central access. No more single point of failure. It felt like a war, not just of information, but of will. And we weren't just defending the truth anymore, we were protecting the right for it to exist. Claire received a letter the next day, no return address, no postmark. Inside was a single photograph, her old student ID burned around the edges, with the words "Your next" written in black Sharpie across the front. Her hands trembled when she handed it to me. Not from fear, but from rage. "They really don't get it, do they?" she whispered. "They still think fear shuts us up." I looked at her and realized something had shifted. We weren't reacting anymore. We were leading. And now they were the ones chasing shadows. Meanwhile, Alina was improving, slowly. She had full days now without confusion. She slept through the night. She asked about the outside world, the internet, the state of medicine. She laughed once, just once, at a joke Drew made about the irony of using memes to fight a medical empire. I clung to that laugh like a trophy. She had moments when the past would slam back into her all at once. A siren, a bright hallway light. But she'd catch herself, breathe through it, then whisper, "They don't own my mind anymore." Those were the moments that made everything worth it. Then came the hearing. It wasn't a trial, not yet, but a closed-session judicial review to determine whether Alina's long-term commitment had been legal under existing psychiatric policy. It was a quiet courtroom, sterile and dim. Alina sat between Claire and me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore a gray sweater I picked out for her, simple and soft, and stared at the floor until her name was called. She stood slowly, stepped forward, and spoke in a voice so steady I felt my chest tighten. I was not a danger to myself. I was a danger to their reputation. That is what they tried to cure. No one interrupted her, not once. When she finished, she sat down and exhaled like she'd just run a marathon inside her lungs. The room stayed silent for a long moment. Then the judge nodded and made it official. Her commitment had been unlawful. She was now, legally and publicly, no longer a patient, no longer forgotten. She was free. We walked out of that courthouse into blinding sunlight. Reporters tried to swarm, but Claire blocked them off. Alina kept walking, head high, the quiet of her triumph more powerful than any headline. I didn't cry until we were back in the car. And when I did, it wasn't grief anymore. It was something else. Relief. Maybe even pride. But I knew it wasn't over. One afternoon, A week after the hearing, I received a letter, handwritten, carefully folded. No threats, no manipulation, just a signature at the bottom, Graham. It said, "You'll understand one day." What we did to protect the future. We couldn't risk letting people like her destroy everything we built. I read it once. Then I read it again. And finally, I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so fragile, so small. After everything, the only thing he had left to offer was justification dressed in cowardice. I didn't reply. I didn't even keep it. I burned it in the kitchen sink, same as Claire had done with her threat. Let that be his legacy, smoke and silence. With the media firestorm still burning, the foundation scrambled to save face. They issued retractions, suspended operations, cut ties with Halden. But it didn't matter. The damage had been done. Their grants were frozen. Their partnerships evaporated. A Senate committee requested testimony. Alina was invited to speak. She declined. Instead, she wrote a public statement, which Claire read aloud on her behalf in a follow-up podcast. It ended with one sentence that echoed across every corner of the internet. "We do not disappear. We remember. And we speak." The response was thunderous. Women wrote in by the thousands, stories, names, photos, even court documents. Some were decades old, some were fresh, and each one fed the momentum. Drew launched a database, a living archive of patient records, survivor accounts, and public resources. Lena coordinated pro bono legal aid for the women who were ready to step forward. Claire was offered a book deal, which she refused, instead using the platform to amplify more voices. I stayed with Alina, helped her adjust to a world she didn't recognize anymore. She got a library card. She joined a community garden. She found peace in slow mornings and crossword puzzles and the sound of wind chimes. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the sky turn gold, she turned to me and said, "You saved me." I shook my head. "You saved yourself. I just helped you find the door." She smiled, and in that moment, I saw her not as a patient, not as a victim, but as a woman who had endured the unimaginable and still chose to keep going. And so did I. Some endings don't come with applause. No headlines, no dramatic gavel strikes in crowded courtrooms. Some endings arrive quietly, like morning light slipping under a door, unnoticed until you feel its warmth on your skin. For Alina and me, it came on a Tuesday. She had planted herbs in the windowsill planter the week before basil, mint, a few stubborn lavender shoots that hadn't sprouted yet. I made tea while she sat at the table, tracing the rim of her mug with one finger, eyes half lost in thought but no longer haunted. She didn't jump at small sounds anymore. She laughed more. She slept without fear of waking up in a room with no door. Watching her rebuild was like watching someone learn to walk again. Not because their legs were weak, but because no one had ever told them they were allowed to move forward. And watching her gave me permission to do the same. The trials came in waves, testimonies, depositions, names the first recognized, faces I didn't. Evelyn Maris broke first, offered full cooperation in exchange for immunity, but her files were damning enough that even without her help, the case stood strong. She cried on the stand, not for the women she drugged, but for her own career. Halden was arrested at a private airport outside Chicago with a briefcase full of burner phones and a ticket to the Cayman Islands. Graham Bishop didn't run. He sat in front of a panel of investigators and delivered a cold, calculated defense that blamed outdated policy structures and institutional groupthink. He used words like clinical necessity and contextual ethics. Not once did he say Alina's name. Not once did he look in my direction. I watched from the back row. He knew I was there. He just didn't know what to do with the version of me that stared back, the version that didn't flinch anymore. In the end, it wasn't just their crimes that unraveled them. It was their arrogance. They thought no one would care, that the women they silenced were forgettable, that the daughters they manipulated would stay obedient. But we weren't children anymore. We weren't afraid. The lawsuits moved slowly, as they always do, but settlements were reached, public apologies issued, foundations dismantled brick by brick. And every time one of them tried to blame it on the past, the archive reminded them the past never left. It just waited. Claire and I stayed close through everything. She moved out of her apartment and into a small house with better locks and a garden in the back. She started mentoring journalism students who wanted to do more than clickbait and celebrity gossip. She never did accept a paycheck for her work on the leak. She said it was about making things right, not making things profitable. Her name appeared in a handful of articles as the student who vanished and returned with the truth. But she never chased the spotlight. The truth was enough. Lena kept working behind the scenes. She created a small network of lawyers, activists, social workers, dedicated to tracking down others who had slipped through the cracks. Her sister's name now sat on a memorial page, not in silence but in protest. The site received thousands of visits a day. Some came to read, some came to grieve, some came to ask if it was too late to start fighting. It never was. And me? I stopped calling myself a survivor. It felt too passive, like something that just happened to me. I wasn't just someone who endured, I was someone who acted, who uncovered, who dragged a secret into the light and made sure it stayed there. I enrolled in school. Psychology, of course. Maybe it was cliché, but it felt like a reclamation. I didn't want to fix broken people. I wanted to make sure no one got labeled broken just because they wouldn't conform. Every class reminded me of what had been stolen from Alina, and every exam I passed felt like a step towards something she never got the chance to finish. Sometimes I'd visit the old town, quietly, not to see them, but to see what was left. The house I grew up in had a new family now. They painted the shutters blue. There was a swing set in the backyard. It felt surreal, walking past it like it had never belonged to me. Like I'd never sat on that porch wondering why the people who raised me looked through me like I was furniture. But I wasn't angry anymore. I didn't want revenge. I had already taken it, not with violence, not with fire, but with truth. And once the truth came out, they had nothing left to control. Alina stayed with me through the summer. Then one morning she told me she wanted to go home. Not to a house, not to a city. Just to a place where the past couldn't follow her like a shadow. She found a quiet apartment in the mountains, near a lake, with more trees than people. She sent me photos sometimes, books stacked on her porch, birds on her windowsill. She adopted a stray cat that wouldn't leave her alone, named him Simon. Her letters were full of small details, the kind most people overlook. But for someone who had once been forced to live inside silence, every detail was a declaration. She was still here. She was still choosing. On the 1-year anniversary of the leak, we held a gathering. Not a protest. Not a press conference. Just a circle. Survivors, daughters, journalists. We met in a public park under a cloudy sky and took turns reading names. Not the names of abusers, but of the women who were lost. The ones who didn't make it out. The ones whose files were stamped with words like delusional, hysterical, resistant. We read their names loud enough that birds flew from the trees, startled by the sound of truth being spoken in a place that once only held whispers. When it was my turn, I held up the last page. There was only one name on it, Alina Voska. Not because she was gone, but because she had made it. And because every time I spoke her name, it felt like a spell strong enough to keep her safe. That night, I sat alone on the rooftop of my building, watching the city lights flicker like blinking eyes in the dark. I thought about how many stories were still buried, how many truths were still locked behind polite lies and corporate walls. But I also thought about the ripple we had started, about how one girl finding one letter could lead to the undoing of an empire, and how the smallest voice, when spoken at the right time, could shake foundations. So no, there wasn't applause. No perfect ending, just a quiet return to self. And that, for me, was enough. Story 2, Greg made the statement on a Tuesday, as simple as that, in between morsels of chicken casserole leftovers. As if they had no meaning, the words escaped his lips. Helen, I've always doubted myself. I believe a DNA test is warranted. I initially believed him to be kidding. They have been parenting Matthew together for 15 years. School projects and sleepless nights with colic, ER visits due to a fractured arm, 15 years of teamwork, or I believed that we were. I chuckled. Avoid being absurd. Greg, however, did not chuckle. His fork clinked on the plate as his jaw tightened. His gaze remained downward, intent as if he were avoiding eye contact. By doubts, what do you mean? I asked thoughtfully. That's precisely what I mean. I've had my doubts, and I believe it's time for us to find out for sure. I couldn't decide which surprised me more, the inference or the fact that he spoke so composedly, as if we were talking about taxes or a dishwasher replacement. When I was 28 and sick of games, I met Greg. He wasn't really romantic, but he was reliable. The sort of man who always remembers to trim the yard on Sundays and pay the bills on time. Although our life was solid, it was never thrilling, or so I believed. A year after our marriage, Matthew arrived. There was no drama, no hassles. Greg was present. When he hugged him, he even started crying. Since I had never saw him weep before, I can recall. Not even at the funeral for his mother. And now this. I lay awake all night counting the rotations of the ceiling fan while gazing at it. I didn't inquire about his doubts. I didn't yell or insist that he retract it. As if he hadn't just dropped a grenade into our life, I laid there next to him and listened to his calm breathing. 2 days later, we were in the clinic. I couldn't help but wonder what the technician saw in us, because she was so friendly, perhaps too sweet. An anxious adolescent and an adulterous spouse. An overbearing spouse. Greg explained that it was for standard tests. When Matthew questioned why we were all seeing a particular doctor, I said nothing. I kept it a secret. Not my sister Denise, who calls me at the same time every night. Not Linda, my best friend, who is constantly talking about guys and their egos. Not even Dr. Reynolds, Matthew's doctor, who has known him since he was 2 years old. Every hour that went by, I just waited, tightened around my chest like a vice. Instead of 7 days, the wait dragged for 9, similar to the technician's 9 estimate. And every hour of those 9 days felt like damp wool stretched across my shoulders, itchy, heavy, suffocating. Greg didn't say much. He got to work early, returned late, and ate supper without saying anything. No kisses. Farewell. No, sweetie. Good night. Between us, the air was sterile and chilly. Like strangers in a hospital ward on the 5th day, there was a courteous stillness. Quietly and without reproach, I asked him, why did he begin to wonder? He didn't even glance up from the section dedicated to sports. A couple of things. Now it doesn't matter. The outcomes will be self-evident. That response didn't set well with me. Not because it was ambiguous. Greg had always been the sort to keep his ideas to himself. But because something pointed, something deliberate, was behind it, I started mentally going over everything again. Who was there to say anything to him? Was he conversing with someone? A coworker, a church buddy? Perhaps someone commented after noticing Matthew. However, even that was illogical. Matthew resembles Greg. The same chin cleft, the same brown curls. But when Greg is told no, he maintains the same short, obstinate frown. Still, something had altered. When I eventually informed Denise, my sister's response was just what I had anticipated. Helen, he's always been insecure. Do you recall the incident with his former partner and the piano instructor? He never trusted anyone, not even himself, she continued. I believed he had moved on from it 10 years ago. However, certain wounds might not heal. They may just scab over until someone scrapes too vigorously. Denise volunteered to come over, but I told her not to. With the vibe this home was giving off, I didn't want her in the house at the moment. It was evident to me even in Matthew. He had become more reserved and silent during supper. As if they may communicate something to him if he waited long enough, he moved his peas about. Is your father upset with you? One night, hardly raising his voice beyond a whisper, he asked. No, I lied, my love. He's simply worn out. I began to pay more attention to Greg's phone checks in the garage, the way he closed his laptop. He used to tell me everything as I entered the room. Workplace spreadsheets are boring. Articles on home repair projects we'd never actually accomplish. Now, however, everything was locked up. Once, when he was taking a shower, I opened his laptop. Now it was password secured. The morning of the results was never the case before. My coffee was not consumed. I was unable to swallow. Matthew was in class. I'm grateful. Greg and I drove quietly to the clinic. He gripped the wheel steadily. My nails were biting into my hands as I clutched mine in my lap. The receptionist's smiles were too radiant. Mr. and Miss S. Alden, straight this way. The physician appeared solemn. He had the face you see on those who are going to break the bad news. He didn't reveal the outcome right away. At first, he didn't even glance at the folder. He looked at each of us in turn and said, "Before I start, I would like to know if you are emotionally ready for what you are going to hear." I turned to face Greg. He didn't blink or flinch, just nod at once. "Yes," he responded. I remained silent. My voice had disappeared somewhere between the parking lot and the chair I was sitting in. Slowly and deliberately, the doctor opened the folder. According to the study, every page flipped sounded like a clock ticking away louder and louder. He said, laying a finger on the paper, "The likelihood of paternity is 0%. My ears ringing. For a moment, my hands felt frigid. I thought I'd black out. My heart wasn't racing. It had vanished. I had no feelings. Just stay away from an odd numbness in the chest that made breathing difficult. "I knew it," Greg said as he sat back and let out a breath through his nostrils. However, the physician ignored him. He continued to observe me. He had a peculiar look in his eyes, nor sympathy, nor condemnation. "Be concerned." Carefully, he added, "There's something else. As a medical practitioner, this worries me." Greg stood up. "What are you discussing?" The doctor glanced at Greg and then back at me. I performed the typical genetic matching procedure, not only between a mother and her kid, but also between a father and son. My stomach turned over. "What?" I muttered. After pausing, he spoke the words that will always stick in my memory. "Alden, Miss S. This indicates that Matthew has no biological kinship with any of you." I gazed at him. I must have heard it wrong. Greg's chair had to scrape the floor. What sort of sick joke is that? The physician held up a hand. "This is serious. To be sure, we ran the samples again. Triple confirmed. It's not a clerical mistake. The boy you have raised is not your biological child. Everything came to a halt. The world, the clock, and the air. That isn't feasible." I took a breath. "He was born to me. I held him. I gave him a nursing. I think you're real." "Gently," the doctor said. "That's why I think you need to speak to the hospital where he was born. There's a possibility, though rare, of a neonatal mix-up." Greg stood red-faced. "So what the hell are you saying?" "That we've been raising a stranger's kid for 15 years. The doctor's silence was louder than any scream. The drive home was quiet at first. But as soon as the front door closed behind us, Greg exploded. "I knew it. I knew something was off. But this is beyond anything I imagined." I tried to speak, to defend myself, to tell him I didn't know, but he wasn't listening. "You had one job, Helen," he snarled. "One job." And with that, he slammed the door to the guest bedroom. His new home, apparently. That night, I opened the box of Matthew's hospital records, wristbands, the birth certificate, faded photographs of me holding him, crying, exhausted but glowing. I know that boy is mine, but now I have no idea how to prove it. The next morning, I sat in the kitchen, staring at a cup of cold coffee. Greg didn't come down. I heard him moving around upstairs. His footsteps heavy, intentional. He didn't even say goodbye when he left for work. I waited until Matthew left for school, then picked up the phone and dialed the number on the back of the hospital folder. St. Joseph's Memorial Hospital. The call rang 7 times before a receptionist picked up. "I need to talk to someone regarding a probable newborn mix-up," I remarked, my voice steady, only because I'd practiced at 50 times in my brain. The woman halted. "Let me move you to records. Records moved me to administration. Administration kept me on wait for 11 minutes. Then a man with a flat, exhausted voice came on the line. "You're talking about an incident from 15 years ago," he inquired. "That would have been early 2009. Our records only go back 10 years in our system. You'd have to make an official request, potentially even a subpoena. A subpoena. You cannot just search for other births on that day." He sighed. "I apologize, ma'am." "Yes, I am. Prevent me from disclosing any identifying information about other patients, even if I wish to assist in upholding the rules. Of course, privacy laws." What a farce. I was being asked to submit documentation like I was applying for a library card when my entire life was falling apart. I ended the call, hands shaking. I then reached for my keys and coat. I would go down there in person if I couldn't obtain answers over the phone. It seemed unreal to drive to St. Joseph's. It had been 15 years since my last visit. The structure was different. New signage and a new wing. The parking lot, however, was identical. Greg had parked there the previous evening, and I followed suit. Clutching my hand, he hurried me in and assured me that everything would be well. The foyer inside smelled like overbrewed coffee and antiseptic. I went to the front desk and requested to talk to a medical records representative. I got a lengthy, uneasy glance from the young woman behind the counter. "I apologize, but I interfered without a court order. This is probably where my child was exchanged at birth. I'm not requesting addresses or names. All I have to do is find out who else gave birth on that day. Please." After hesitating, she looked over her shoulder. She murmured, "Wait here," after 10 minutes. The ID badge of Diana Lively, the Director of Patient Services, was read by a woman in her 60s as she approached. "I remember you." Before I could say anything, she said quietly, "You had an emergency C-section in room 207. You had issues. We nearly lost you." I blinked. "Do you recall me?" She gave a nod. "For 40 years I have been employed here. Some tales stick with you." We took up residence in her office. I told her everything. The results of the DNA test, the shock, the insufferable doubt. After silently listening, she took out a compact binder from a closed file drawer. "Around that time, we were in the midst of switching to digital records," she recalled. "There are still some things on paper." She traced a column of scribbled timings and names with her finger. "That day, 3 more people were born. 1 girl, 2 boys. The only C-section was you." My heart was racing. Could someone have made a mistake? She let out a breath. That week was a tumultuous one. 2 nurses are absent due to illness. There wasn't enough personnel on the maternity floor. I'll tell you the truth. Indeed, that is feasible. But demonstrating it, she gave me a direct glance. "Helen, you'll need legal assistance." And quickly. It may have gone undiscovered for 15 years if there was a switch. However, the identical question may soon be asked by someone else. I stayed in the hospital instead of going home. I was unable to. I sat in the hospital parking lot in my vehicle. The steering wheel is numb, observing the ancient maternity wing's edge as the afternoon light sets. A kid, mine, yet not mine, in all relevant ways. I believed I had given birth. I brought him up, put him to sleep, kept him afloat during fevers, schoolyard fighting, heartbreak over a goldfish that wouldn't swim anymore. Given that, what does biology mean? I had to know the truth, though, and I needed a lawyer for that. First, I gave Linda a call. The second ring caught her attention. "Helen, at last. I've been extremely anxious. What's happening?" Her voice was comforting, familiar, and warm. I nearly broke it. However, I remained steady. "I must have a name, an attorney, someone decent. Someone who won't make fun of me when I refer to them as my child." Perhaps it was switched at birth. Silence fell. Then a silence. "Are you serious?" "I mean it." She made no inquiries. "Give Nathan Marks a call. He's not cheap, but before he had a family, he handled some strange medical malpractice cases. 7 figures. When a sponge was implanted inside their daughter by a medical team, the sky was charcoal gloomy by the time I arrived at his office. Nathan was in his early 40s. Sharp features, worn-out eyes, and a clean cut. When I explained everything to him, he didn't blink. The doctor's response is tested by DNA, Diana Lively's reluctant acknowledgement. I've heard of 2 additional incidents like this. "Flipping through a yellow notebook in both," he said. "Obtaining access to the delivery logs takes months. In one instance, a youngster was discovered 2 counties away. The biological parents were never found. What would happen if the other family was the first to know?" Nathan gave me a glance. "Level is determined by their desires. Custody. Make contact. Just replies sometimes. Let me be honest, though. In particular, for your kid, this might become messy and emotional." I gave a nod. I still hadn't spoken to Matthew. My throat constricted each time I gazed at him. "You might not be ours, but how? And we have no idea who you are?" The previous evening, Greg had not returned home. No texts, no calls. I had no idea where he had gone. A tiny, ashamed part of me didn't give a damn. I could not afford to follow him as he was becoming more and more blamed. I was sitting with a box of old photos on the side of my bed that night when I spotted something strange. One shot taken immediately after the delivery, when I was still fuzzy from the anesthetic, had a nurse in the backdrop. She had no smile on her face. Her eyes widened in surprise. Her badge was misaligned, but she was holding a swaddled infant. Unreadable. She had a youthful appearance. 20, maybe. Additionally, a bassinet blurred behind her. Or was it 2? I turned the picture over. Helen and Matthew had been scrawled by Greg, printed with black marker on January 4, 2009. I spent a lot of time staring at that date. I then gave Diana a call. That evening was a nurse on duty, early 20s. Long, somewhat thin blonde hair. She's in one of my shots. A pause occurred. Yes, Diana answered softly. Marla Pembroke was that person. Back then, she was new. First month of employment. How did she end up? One more pause. She resigned. No notification after 2 weeks. Marla Pembroke was no longer there, not on any social media platforms, not on LinkedIn, not even an announcement of a wedding. Finding any evidence of her took Nathan's private investigator 4 days and a minor miracle. She was working part-time as a florist in a small town 2 hours north while residing under her married identity, Marla Jennings. I didn't hold out. I was the only one that drove up there. The rural roads meander like my mind. I was unsure of what to say to her. How could I? Hello. I believe you may have unintentionally taken my child. The flower business was sandwiched between a fish and tackle shop and a cafe. Quaint. The door has a bell and pink shutters. I entered and smelled the aroma of eucalyptus and flowers. Thin, blonde hair pulled back. A lady behind the counter was clipping stems. When she glanced up and spotted me, her hands shook a little. Marla, may I assist you? She stopped. She stopped smiling. Apologies. Do I? My name is Helen Alden. It was at St. Joseph's that I gave birth. January 4, 2009. You were there. In her eyes, I saw it. Recognition. Then, panic. I'm not looking. It's been years since I worked in medicine. I can't recall. Do you? I said quietly. Just listen to me, please. I wasn't told to leave by her. It was something. Glass faces and buckets of flowers lined the rear area where I followed her. On an overturned crate, she offered me a seat. She didn't sit. I was 21, she said. I was in my second week. We lost 2 nurses. There was mayhem during the night shift. Back-to-back labors were experienced by 2 women. One emergency, one natural. Me, I said. She gave a nod. She added that there was a mix-up with the bassinets. The babies had been transported for observation, and someone from administration was hurrying me when we were meant to double-check the ID bands and crib tags. I believed I was correct. I vowed to do so. I felt sick to my stomach. Do you mean that you swapped them? I didn't mean to. Her eyes were watering as she murmured. However, I went to my supervisor later that week, after realizing something wasn't adding up. She warned me that saying anything would destroy lives, that it was most likely nothing, and I would be held accountable if I spoke up. So you quit? She gave a nod. Was there ever anyone else who came forward? Was there anyone else who had suspicions? She gave a head shake. The number. However, I do recall the other family, the birthing mother. Of course. Her infant was irritable, wouldn't sleep. She seemed worn out. Are you familiar with her name? Her initial name is all I can recall. Lorna. Her hair was red. Her husband? I believe he was a construction worker. Lorna, that's all I have, creation of red hair. Even though it wasn't much, I will always remember that night. Marla's voice cracked as she said, Not once. I took a business card with Marla's new last name scrawled on the reverse and walked out with trembling hands. Nathan would be curious right away. I drove home first, though. Shooting hoops into the flimsy net, Matthew was on the porch. Greg never made repairs. He wiped perspiration from his brow and said, Hey, Mom, are you all right? You appear worn out. I gave a nod. Only running errands. I have a lot on my mind. Once more, Dad is not at home. I am aware. He bounced the ball twice, looked at me. Are you two fighting? I made an effort to grin. That kind of thing. He gave the ball to me. Want to shoot? Yes, I did. We played till dusk. Only the 2 of us. Laughing. Relocating. Inhaling. Maybe the boy isn't mine. However, it was somehow. Nathan searched every database he could find for Lorna's name. Red hair and Lorna, however, didn't exactly help to focus things. Only one birth record from the county for that day stood out among the many that were available. Lorna Blake was 24 years old when she gave birth. The address is only 2 towns away. A newborn boy had been born to her. No issues. 48 hours later, they were released. Everything was there in front of me. I phoned the number Nathan gave me, my hands shaking. No response. I traveled to the place the following day, a 2-story brick house in a peaceful area. On the porch are wind chimes. In the driveway is a scooter. After hesitating, I knocked. A female voice responded. A loose bun was pushed into auburn hair, eyes that are tired. She gave me the kind of look a mother gives a stranger who approaches her kids too closely. Indeed. Hello, I apologize for disturbing you. Are you Blake Lorna? Do I know you? I am. I think we might have given birth on the same day at the same hospital, but I might have been wrong. January 4, 2009. St. Joseph's Memorial. She gave me such a lengthy look that I nearly turned and left. You'd better come in, she said. The scent of soap and cinnamon filled the house. A adolescent boy wore earphones while sitting on the couch. He looked at his phone, then up at me. Jacob is that person. Her number was 15. Anything that isn't beige will not be eaten by Moody. Something about the way he cocked his head made him look different from me. My spine tingled as a result. I started by saying, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I recently learned that there may have been a mix-up at the hospital and that the boy I raised may not be biologically mine or my husband's. She went pallid. Hold on. Jacob, do you think? I gave a nod. As crazy as it seems, a nurse has confirmed that there were discrepancies that night based on the results of the DNA test. I'd rather not start a fight. All I want is answers. Lorna took a firm seat on the armrest. She muttered, I always wondered. Neither Jacob's pediatrician nor I had the same blood type. Wiped it off. Claimed that while it was feasible, there were other factors at play. He never looked like any member of our family, and his hair became black early. I remained silent. Ray struggles with doubt, but I pondered in private. Her spouse, Ray, is a construction worker. Everything fit. I said, I'm not here to take anything from you. However, I think I could be his biological mother. We sat in silence for a long time. Then she posed the query I had been afraid to ask, as well as my son. He's where? In the house? I said quietly. Matthew is his name. He's intelligent, kind as a basketball player. As of yet, he knows nothing. She put her fingers to her lips and nodded. Her eyes glistened. I've never spoken this to anyone before except you. I said, she said. However, I suffered from postpartum depression for months. I've always believed that my inability to bond effectively is a personal trait. However, perhaps, maybe it was because I knew somewhere deep down he wasn't mine. I wanted to cry, yell, hug her. Something. Rather, I inquired. Would you? Just to be sure, would you be amenable to a DNA test? She gave a nod. I saw Matthew shoot hoops once again later that evening while sitting on my patio. I made an effort to put Jacob in his shoes. I was unable to. I had no desire to. I had Matthew. That couldn't be altered by a test. However, I had to confront reality. We were on the verge of something irrevocable if the outcomes were as I had feared. Greg, too. It had been 3 nights since he had returned home. I used our shared account to check his credit card logins. At a hotel across town, 1 charge. Another in a dining establishment. I failed to realize. A third for a single rose arrangement. He wasn't by alone. 3 days later, the results of the DNA testing were in. I requested Nathan to give me the results over the phone. I couldn't stand to open another mail. He spoke steadily over the phone. Matthew is Lorna's son, while Jacob is your biological son. I sobbed till my throat hurt while sitting on my living room floor. For the manner that everything I believed to be true about my life had been based on a mistake made by a stranger, not for the science or the evidence. I still hadn't told Matthew. I thought about that moment every time I looked at him. The time when everything would fall apart for him. The mother he adored wasn't his. The father who'd abandoned him couldn't even look at him anymore. And a stranger, a youngster he had never met, was out there with a reality that none of us had requested. That night, I didn't get any sleep. I traveled to the motel mentioned in Greg's transaction history the next morning, after taking the day off from work. He answered the door naked, shocked Helen behind him. A woman in her early 30s appeared, bathrobe, dark hair. She had no intention of hiding. I responded, "You won't even deny it." Greg gave his neck a quick massage. It had no significance. I chuckled. Stays at motels, meals, and flowers. It seems to have had some significance. She pays attention to me. He lost his temper. For 15 years, she didn't tell me lies. Before I knew I had moved, I was slapped. My hand hurt. I told the truth. In the hospital, I bled. Our son was in my arms. Our boy, indeed. and gave him my undivided love. The was unaffected by the DNA test. Greg, you ran. You were afraid of the reality, so you hid behind a younger lady. He remained silent, just turned and moved farther into the space, as if my presence were an issue. I drove quietly home. Earlier, Lorna texted me. Jacob is questioning. I still haven't told him. Maybe we should meet. We set up a time. Saturday. The park close to the city borders is known as neutral ground. A quiet spot with open space and no one to overhear if things got emotional. The weather on Saturday was gloomy with chilly winds. I only informed Matthew that he was meeting someone significant when I brought him. His favorite hoodie was on him. He had his hands jammed deep in his pockets. Lorna and Jacob had already arrived. He was taller in person, Jacob, thinner, more sharp. He cocked his head, as Matthew often did when he was perplexed, when he saw us coming. For a long, quiet period, the guys gazed at one another. Matthew then turned to face me. "What's happening on, Mom?" "Lauren." He spoke in a weak voice. "Helen here, Jacob, honey. Your biological mother is her." Like a boulder dropped into a quiet pond, the words fell. I saw the wrinkle on Matthew's brow. He withdrew his hand as I grabbed for it. "What are you discussing?" I dropped to my knees. "When you were born, the hospital made a mistake, my love. I got the incorrect baby from them. However, I was unaware. I had no idea. I reared you because I loved you. My son is you. You always will be." He had large eyes. "I'm not yours then. No, you are just not by blood." He took a step back. "Is Dad aware?" He departed because I nodded. I was unable to respond. He glanced across to Jacob. "You're me then?" Jacob seemed just as confused. "I'm not sure." Neither of them said anything more. They did nothing except stand. Their features bear the marks of 15 years of someone else's decisions. After the park, the days were peaceful, too silent. Matthew barely spoke to me. After returning home from school, he locked himself in his room. The sound of video games and bouncing basketballs vanished. Through his walls, I could no longer hear music. The home seemed to be holding its breath. Some of the food I put outside his door vanished. Most of it didn't. After dark on the third day, I discovered him sitting on the porch steps with his knees pulled to his chest and his hood up. "Hello?" Sitting next to him, I spoke quietly. He avoided looking at me, simply gazed at the road. "Will I have to move in with that woman?" "No." My voice cracked. "No one is going to take you away from me, my love." "But she's my real mom," I murmured. "I'm your true mother. Perhaps not by blood, but in all other respects." He used his sleeve to wipe his nose. "I no longer know who I am." This time he didn't pull away when I put a touch on his back. I answered, "Neither do I. However, perhaps we can work things out together." Nathan and I had another meeting the next morning. The first letter to the hospital was written by him. Formal notification of the lawsuit. The tone was obvious. "We are aware. And we're not staying quiet. They will delay." He cautioned. "They always do. However, now that the error has been verified, all that remains is pressure and perseverance." I inquired about the possibility of including the other family. I didn't want to go to war without Lorna knowing, but she hadn't yet brought up a lawyer. Nathan paused. "She might not share your desires." I responded, "I'm not attempting to take Jacob away from her. All I want is to get to know him." It was Lorna who called that afternoon. "I'd like to meet Jacob," she remarked politely. "He has inquiries." In spite of everything, I grinned. "That would be nice." Greg never returned home. He didn't give a call. At last, I came to terms with the fact that he wouldn't. Oddly enough, it didn't break me. Not now. I had already lost a family of one sort. I wouldn't let another one slip. On a wet Wednesday, Jacob stopped by. At first, he was silent. He stood with his hands buried in his jacket pockets in the corridor. I offered him a drink. He gave a gentle shake of his head. All I want to do is see where I would have been raised. I took him to the backyard, where Matthew's progress chart was still engraved on the fence, then the family room. Post the images on the wall, the toothy smile of Matthew in second grade. He and Greg in front of a project at a scientific fair. Jacob spent a lot of time staring at a picture of me with Matthew on my hip. The heat of June burned my face. He answered, "That may have been me." I took a deep breath. In some way, it still may be. For hours, we sat and talked gently about school, music, and other topics that people say when they are unsure of where to begin. By the time he departed, however, we had relaxed. He gave me a firm hug, real yet awkward. Lorna called later that week. Matthew invited him to join them for supper. Into the phone, I grinned. "What were you saying?" "Yes," I replied. "We agreed, of course, and I said yes. No pressure. Just a dinner. One step at a time." Nathan's letter was answered by the hospital. Denial that is well phrased and does not acknowledge guilt. But there was an offer concealed in the wording. Mediation that is confidential. A precursor. They were aware that this could not be permanently buried. Nathan gave me a direct look. "This is something we can promote. It won't happen quickly. However, if you desire justice, true justice, we go all the way." I gave a nod. We go. Regarding Greg, he never returned home. He used a lawyer I didn't know to petition for divorce. Nothing, just papers and a hurried signature, no talk, no apologies. Oddly enough, I was okay. In years for the first time. I wasn't trying to be extra careful. In my own home, I wasn't little. One evening, I watched the lads from the porch. My guys gather in the driveway to shoot baskets. Not blood brothers, nor are they strangers. Just two souls orbiting one another gently, attempting to understand their circumstances. My marriage ended. I didn't lose my son, but I did lose assurance. I also maintained my will to stand up for the truth. Certain errors cannot be corrected, but they are confrontable.